If you've been flicking between multiple news channels, heck, if you've been browsing YouTube comments lately, you'd probably be forgiven for thinking that there's more than one Ukraine war going on. After all, according to some of the narrative, Russia's getting their butt kicked, has been thrown out of Kiev, and is certainly on the strategic back foot. But if you look at the other side of the comment and news war, the ongoing information conflict over Ukraine, then it's the Ukrainian army that has been utterly destroyed, and Russia is, as always, mere days or weeks away from imminent victory. All of this encapsulates a little bit of the info war that we're seeing around the Ukrainian conflict, where a battle for the truth is pretty much as important as the actual events on the ground, at least so far as most of the rest of the world is concerned. And it all seems to come back to, in the comments that I've seen on my videos, comments on other videos, and also just discourse in the public, an obsession with one single question, a question which I very carefully avoided in some of my earlier videos. Who's winning? What is actually happening in the war so far? Now, I deliberately avoided that question in my initial video set. I focus on items that you can quantify and demonstrate, like the efficacy of certain equipment. I tried to demonstrate that the fight was more even than people might expect, that Russia had badly aligned its investment and its goals, things like that that I could establish and prove. But there is a huge appetite out there for an understanding of who is actually winning and triumphing. And you know what? I have to acknowledge that that question is important. If Ukraine is truly doing well, there's going to be greater appetite to support it, to maintain it, to not give up on it. If indeed Russia is days or weeks away from victory, then other nations and members of the public in general might not be supportive of sanctions on Russia or turning against Russia. They might need to hedge their bets. So I accept that this question is fundamentally important. So I've decided today that I'm going to attempt to tackle it, firstly by looking at some of the myths that are growing up around this conflict, all around this point of how is it actually going, and secondly, I will take a shot. I'll make an attempt at answering how is the conflict going and who's winning. But first, let me just say that this is a problematic question from an analytics standpoint, and I'm going to illustrate it here. If you look at that chessboard on the right, with no other information, you would immediately conclude that black is screwed. White has won. But if I told you that it's move 79 for white and the game was they have to mate by turn 80 or they lose, then suddenly that game takes on a different measure. If white's clock is showing 0 at a tournament, they've lost, even though an initial look at the screen says otherwise. What I'm trying to say here is that you need to know what each side is aiming to achieve. What are the rules of the game? How do you judge success before you jump in and actually make a statement on who is winning and which way a conflict is likely to go? Because if you take account of this, you quickly understand there are situations where both sides might be able to claim that they're winning at the same time without necessarily lying. Let's look at Russia's stated military objectives here for a moment, as they have put them. Demilitarize Ukraine, denazify Ukraine, protect the Donbass, and contain NATO. All of those are vague as shit when you get down to it. If you have destroyed one bit of Ukrainian hardware, if you've blown up one Azov soldier, if you force Ukraine to say they respect the right of individuals in the Donbass to speak Russian, which is something that they will probably have conceded anyway in their own territory, even if Russia cedes that territory back and withdraws support for Donetsk and Luhansk, and Ukraine agrees not to join NATO in the immediate future, there is a universe in which you can argue that Russia has achieved its objectives. But the scenario I just described to you would in reality be a titanic freaking embarrassment. But according to the objectives they've set, they could claim that they've won. Ukraine equally can be pretty vague with its objectives. There is characterizations wherein if Ukraine preserves its sovereignty at all against the gigantic Russian bear, it's won. And then there's others who argue that Ukraine has only won if Russia is driven out of Donetsk, out of Luhansk, if Crimea is reclaimed, the NATO flag is raised over Kiev, the joint command structure for NATO relocates and bases itself permanently in Kiev, and the world bows before the brave Ukrainian defenders. Like, there's a spectrum of characterization of what it means to declare victory in this sense. So I just want to put that caveat up front before I jump in. So what I am going to try and do in order to address these questions in some coherent ways, I'm going to deal with some of the myths that are growing up first, the arguments around the state of affairs that I think belong as to be characterized as myths, and also the supporting arguments that sit behind them. The argument that Russia has destroyed the Ukrainian military, which is very popular with the Russian Ministry of Defense and some Russians on the internet. The supporting myth, which is that, okay, maybe Russia isn't doing so well after all, but that's because, they're choosing to do badly, and they could turn this around if they want to. Sort of a sending their best mark too. And then finally, the flip side myth, which is that Ukraine is basically won and Russia is done for. Having answered those three questions, I'm going to deal with the who is winning question as best as I possibly can, but expect some caveats. And then finally, I'll give a bit of a channel update. All of this essentially serves as a preface for the video I really want to make after this, which is something I can be more certain about, which is how will Russia fare if this war goes long. One final point before we jump in. I make it a point to listen to all evidence that is presented and to seek out evidence. So if you have hard competing evidence that either complements or contradicts anything I say in this or any of my videos, there is an email address where you can send your hard evidence and submissions to. Please leave a comment on the video to note that you have submitted something, to know to go look and check, and please take it as in spirit which is intended. I'm not after polemic arguments. I'm after hard evidence that suggests that something that I have said is either correct or wrong, or I'm missing some sort of nuance. The moment you stop listening, you've stopped analyzing, and I'm determined to listen. Let's get into it. All right, myth one. And if you've been listening to the Russian Ministry of Defense and Russian commentators on Twitter, you're probably familiar with this one. The claim that Russia has basically destroyed the Ukrainian military. And there's some supporting cases they put behind this, which have only grown in intensity ever since the MOD in Russia declared that phase one of the operation, which was the demilitarization of Ukraine, is basically complete. The arguments are, Zelensky is asking for aid, therefore he is in trouble. After all, the Ukrainians wouldn't be asking for help if they weren't in dire straits. Secondly, they point to Russian official kill claims and statistics to suggest that the Ukrainian army has basically been destroyed, and they make an argument that Kiev was a feint in order to deal with the counter-argument, which would seem to suggest that Russia is really struggling on the battlefield. So let's deal with each of these in turn. I'm going to deal with the easiest one first. Asking for help doesn't mean you're losing. It means that you want help. The essential claim here is that Zelensky asking for equipment, asking for tanks, APCs, anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, asking for jets, this frequency, this constant request for more material from Ukraine towards the Western powers basically suggests that obviously they're running out of material. The counterpoint is that this fails at a logical level. You'd always rather have more ordnance and more equipment available to you than less when you're fighting a war. More metal means less blood has to be expended. The USSR and UK didn't stop Lend-Lease, where they were getting support from the United States in World War II. They didn't stop that in 1944 or 1945, when it was clear which way the war was going. In fact, deliveries to the USSR peaked in 1944. There is no other year of the Great Patriotic War where the USSR received more support through Lend-Lease than 1944, when the issue was probably already decided. The next point here is obviously munitions crisis can be universal. Even if you're doing well on the battlefield, you can be running low on munitions. And in fact, armies have almost always faced munitions crises, specifically at the start of major conflicts. They burn through their initial stocks, and industry hasn't adapted to support expenditure. So as a result, there is a pinch in terms of ammunition supply. We have some evidence that the Russians are suffering from a pinch in terms of PGM availability. Well, the Ukrainians are also going to face shortages, so they're going to ask for more help. Also, Russia has asked for assistance from China. They haven't gotten much, or at least we have seen no indication that they have gotten much, but certainly they have also shaken that tree. They asked Kazakhstan for troops and military assistance early before this kicked off, and obviously they've been declined. But that doesn't mean that Russia was short on munitions before this started. It meant that they were looking for as much support as they could possibly get. You can also get shortages just if you're enlarging your force. Like, I don't know, if you're mobilizing new armies and territorial defense forces and militias and trying to put more guns in more hands than you had equipment for at the start of the war, which is exactly the scenario that Ukraine is now in, attempting to wage a people's war, a national war of resistance against an invading power. So I'm going to dismiss this one out of hand. It's always seemed odd to me. Like, what do you want? Like, if you're winning, you stop asking for help in order to make it more fair for the other side. I genuinely don't understand this one. I include it for completeness. The more interesting one is Russian kill claims, because there are... contrary to those of you who say I don't look at Russian sources, I follow the Russian MOD every day, and I follow their claims and their updates, especially when they are, I'm very thankful when they do subtitle them and translate them into English. And they put out quite comprehensive claims of destroyed Ukrainian equipment almost on a daily basis. And the claim here goes that the Russian claims would basically have destroyed the Ukrainian military if they're true, and the assumption is that they're true. My counterpoint initially is that there's great historical precedence for overclaiming. when you move away from non-visually confirmed losses to losses that are claimed inflicted on the enemy by belligerent powers, I don't think you'd find a power in history that has been honest or accurate in their projections of enemy losses. It also stretches all credibility to reconcile the Russian claims that we have seen in some systems with the observation of events on the ground. And I'll expand that more in a moment. But basically, if the Russian claims were true, then the Ukrainians would be fighting them off with sharpened sticks at this point. Sharpened sticks and like AKs from the early Cold War and Mosin Nagants and bayonets. Like, there wouldn't be a huge amount left in the Ukrainian army. I'll put them up against the Ukrainian inventory for comparison in a moment. But despite the fact that the Russian MOD numbers, and to a lesser extent the Ukrainian MOD numbers, strike me as complete horseshit, they're certainly circulating around the internet. Here you have a wonderful tweet, which I will leave there for people to judge themselves. It includes such amazing features as 91 of 55 helicopters and 398 of 50 UAVs having been destroyed, and loss rates for aircraft and tanks being 95 and 91% respectively. Basically, this is people quoting the Russian MOD statistics. But in this case, I'm sorry, I'm going to dwell on this for a moment because it blew my mind. Not even quoting the Russian MOD correctly, because the Russian MOD doesn't claim 1,969 tanks have been destroyed. They claim 1,969 tanks and armored vehicles have been destroyed, which is why I don't know where these guys got their armored vehicles destroyed number from, and they've just stuck the whole larger number in the tanks column, and they've taken pre-invasion figures from some source that isn't the Russians, which leads to these obscene 400%, 600% loss rates. It's nuts. This hurts me, people. Please stop doing it. You are not doing data science if you just take the claims of both sides at face value, put them in an Excel table, and publish them. This is not news. To take it back away from my anger at some of the public sphere debate on this for a moment, the Russian claims themselves are rapidly approaching absurdity in a sense. What I put up there for you is a graph which shows three sets of Russian claims. The total bar is what the Russians claim the pre-war inventory of a piece of equipment was for Ukraine. The sum of the blue and orange are the Russian claims, and blue is what we have visually confirmed data on. So you can see that there are significant gaps in some places. So tanks and armored fighting vehicles, the Russians claim something like 1,900 destroyed. We saw that on the previous slide. We have 233 visual confirmations, which means the Russians claim that Ukraine has 468 tanks and armored fighting vehicles left. Russia claims that they have one Bayraktar TB2 left. And the interesting thing the Russians have done here, in order to avoid the embarrassing situation of claiming to have destroyed more than the Ukrainians had, which is the problem we saw on the previous slide, is they've actually pumped up their projections of how many various systems the Ukrainians have in service. So, for example, they project there a slightly larger number of aircraft in the Ukrainian Air Force and available to the Ukrainians than most of the other sources I've been able to consult on have, for example. They've sort of pumped the numbers up so that they'd never claim they've destroyed everything. The problem with these claims is twofold. If these numbers were accurate, it's hard to imagine a force on the planet that would still be combat effective having suffered these percentage of losses. Like, it's hard to imagine that the Ukrainian air defense network would still be intact. And we know it's still intact because Russia is still treating Ukraine as contested airspace. They're still being very careful in how they fly their sorties. They're still coming in low. They're not launching raids that might attract Buk or Tor or S-300 fire. That would be very hard to do if indeed you had knocked out 3/4 of the Ukrainian air defense network to date. You'd just keep doing what you're doing. You'd ramp the pressure up and you'd have air dominance, and the war would be fundamentally different. It's hard to imagine that the Ukrainians would be able to post videos of armored attacks and ambushes if that many of their tanks and armored fighting vehicles have been destroyed. So I think it's safe to conclude that there is a discrepancy between the kills that we can evidence on the Russians have made on Ukrainian equipment and what they've claimed and what they claim Ukraine has still has left. If these figures were accurate, we would expect the war on the ground to be going very differently than it seems to. The figures are likely inflated. I'd also like to note that I'm interested to see where the Russian MOD goes in the future now, because if they keep increasing their claims, they're going to get to the point where they will have claimed to have destroyed the entire Ukrainian inventory more than once over, at a time when Western deliveries of heavy equipment still aren't at the level where they meaningfully move the needle. So they're going to run into a barrier of how far they can increase their claims, but at the same time, their losses are likely to continue to increase, especially if they launch a new offensive into the teeth of Ukrainian defenses in the Donbass. So either they're going to increase their claims to the point of absurdity, killing more Ukrainian tanks than Ukrainian tanks exist, for example, or they're going to have to lower the claims while also being forced to admit an increasingly large number of losses. I'm not sure they've thought that far ahead. They've sort of painted themselves into a bit of a corner here, but there's no reason, in summary, to take these claims on their own merit. We will look at the Ukrainian claims later. Those are slightly less problematic, but I still wouldn't take them at face value. And then there's the Kiev was a feint argument. So this is the protection point. So if you look at these arguments, it's often made in the sense that the Ukrainian army has been destroyed, and then when you say, but you retreated from Kiev, the argument is Kiev was a feint. Now, here's my caveat. Only the Russians know for sure if Kiev was a feint, but the application of any degree of reason and military logic would seem to suggest that either it wasn't a feint or it was one of the most poorly planned and executed ones in military history. It was far too costly to be a feint. The Russians rammed a large number of battalion tactical groups down that road. They put a lot of logistical effort into it, and they took very extensive casualties doing it. At the same time, it's sort of inefficient in that Kiev has its own indigenous defensive capability. All those militias, all those local defenders, local laborers, those are all military resources which can't readily be picked up and moved to another part of the country. They're there to defend Kiev and its suburbs, but you can't just pick up the entire civilian population and move it to the Donbass in order to wage operations there. So if you don't attack Kiev directly, you're not actually engaging that military power of Ukraine. So what Russia does here is they take mobile, offensive-capable formations, battalion tactical groups, and logistics, supporting logistics, and they ram them into Ukrainian forces that would not be relevant in, say, a focused offensive just in the east of the country. They also have lots of elements of this offensive that suggest that it was intended to take the capital. The airborne offensive on day one, the fact that Rosgvardia troops, who are there when you want to keep order over a civilian population, were there in the vanguard. All of this screams that they weren't expecting a fight and they wanted to take the capital or secure the capital, not that it was a feint to draw out Ukrainian military forces. The other thing I'll say is that in terms of redeployment practicality, pulling out, it's difficult. They're going to have to redeploy these forces quite a long way in order to get them to the Eastern Front. Ukraine can use interior lines to redeploy their people. It was highly politically costly because a lot of people are looking at this and going, dear God, Russia's lost the battle for Kiev. That is an international embarrassment. So they've paid a political cost for launch. If this was a feint and they always intended to withdraw, they've signed up to a great political cost in order to do so. And finally, it doesn't make sense in the context of the objectives that they've claimed they want to achieve, because pressuring Kiev is one of the best ways to get Ukraine to come to the table. And if you have destroyed the entire Ukrainian military, if you have neutralized all of their heavy equipment, if you have basically destroyed Ukraine's army, then why are you retreating? Take the capital. Either you haven't destroyed them, you were just feinting them, and you're pulling out now to go achieve your real objective, or you have destroyed them, in which case you should have pressed on to the capital. That's a bit glib, to be honest, but you hopefully get where I'm going with this. It's hard to reconcile Russian claims with what we saw about how the offensive was constructed, about how it was represented, about how it was executed. So my conclusion here, and my supposition, not database, my supposition here is that either this was not a feint, it was actually intended to take Kiev, or this was very poorly planned and executed. Okay, so let's say that one's in the dirt, that the Russian claim that the Ukrainian military is basically completely destroyed. Let's dismiss that for a moment, because it's basically based on Russian MOD claims, not on any of the developments we've seen on the ground, which include Ukrainian counterattacks, significant Russian attrition, and signs of an ongoing contested airspace fight. The next layer of the argument down is that Russia could turn this around easily if they wanted to, that for some reason Russia is basically playing nice in Ukraine. And this has a few sub-arguments to it. The first, and I'm sure you've heard it, is Russia could easily flatten Ukraine if it chose to. The second is that Russia has a huge army it's not using. This is the evolution of the they're not sending their best argument, that Russia has huge forces that it could commit, and if it did commit them, Ukraine would fold. And third, that they're being really careful in how they use their artillery and their fire support. I'm going to address all three of those, but then I'm just going to ask the question, like, what are people even getting at with these three? Because I'm not sure that they really support the underlying point that Russia is doing fine. The first subpoint is that Russia could just flatten Ukraine. I'm sure you've seen this either discussed in Russian media or on Telegram or on YouTube comments. Like, this one does the rounds. My evaluation here is that yes, if you want to use nukes, sure. But nukes are not on the table here. People love talking about them. They're scary. They capture the imagination. But Russian doctrine says that nukes will only be used when the actual integrity of the state, the fundamental survival of the Russian state, is at risk. And it clearly isn't in the conflict in Ukraine. It's not even a war. It's a special military operation. So you're going to argue that the continuity of the Russian state is at risk? You can't do that. You can't fit that circle in that square hole. The second point here is that the use of nukes would be so horribly escalatory that I tremble to think of what NATO and Western powers, and even neutral and allied powers, what China, what India, what nations that are either neutral or Russia aligned would do if the precedent of tactical nuclear weapon use was unlocked. So, especially if it was used against civilian industrial centers, that could conceivably lead to an escalatory cycle which would end the Russian state. So I leave the nukes out of this question. If you're talking more about a conventional campaign, no, not really. Russia obviously can't use artillery on most Ukrainian cities because they've withdrawn. They're not in artillery or rocket range of them. If you're talking about strategic aviation, not really. They've got something like 16 Tu-160 Blackjacks, which are their most impressive strategic bombers, and they've got 60 of those Tu-95s. Now, the Tu-95, the Bear, as a strategic bomber, is an impressive aircraft for what it is, but it's an old turboprop, and you're talking about flying these things into contested airspace to carpet bomb cities. Those are Military Balance 2021 figures, by the way, if you want to check them. That's not the sort of air force that can flatten Ukrainian industrial, residential, and military logistics centers. And most of these, in terms of their training and their weapons configuration, are designed to stand off weapons platforms anyway. Like, these bombers are being used, but they're being used to launch standoff munitions, cruise missiles. I'm not sure they even train for like a carpet bombing mission. And if you fly Tu-95s into the teeth of intact Ukrainian air defenses, I think they're all just going to get shot down. But even if that wasn't the case, what would flattening Ukraine actually accomplish for Russia militarily? We'll come back to this question, but the commentators on this side often seem to couch this in terms of Russia is being noble by not flattening or destroying Ukrainian centers of resistance with, carpet bombing or massive application of fires. My question is, does this actually achieve anything? After all, in some ways, it's easier to defend rubble than intact buildings. I'm not sure what this actually achieves rather than massively ramping up civilian casualty counts. Then there's the point around Russia having a huge army that it's not using. I addressed this one in my reservist video, if you've seen this. This question, it really depends what you mean. Russia does have very large reserve forces, and they have battalion tactical groups and forces that they haven't deployed. However, even though there are rumors of Russia doing the things it can do, which skirts around the edges, so you're allowed to call up ex-conscript reservists for training, you can't deploy them, but there's rumors they're going to call them up and then pressure them to sign contracts so they can be deployed, for example. But those are all rumors at the moment. They come mostly out of the Ukrainian MOD. There's no sign in the public sphere that Russia is willing to go to a total wartime mobilization, call up its reserve base, roll out the reserve tanks, and hoorah, charge this thing. That isn't there. And until that's there, no, Russia doesn't have a large army that it's not using. Most of the ready available BTGs they have are employed. The ones that they haven't employed are doing critical tasks elsewhere, or are seen to be doing critical tasks elsewhere. You can't strip the fronts facing Japan. You can't strip the fronts facing China. You certainly don't want to leave all the borders with NATO undefended. You don't want to pull the troops away from Moscow or St. Petersburg. there's not much left. And if you send that out, then Russia's strategic vulnerability will be at a level that it arguably hasn't been since the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. So usually this seems to be a result of a misunderstanding of Russian Federation manpower figures. It's usually people looking at the 1 million active military, 2 million reservists, and saying, therefore, they only have 200,000 in Ukraine. There must be a lot more where that came from. The answer is not really. You have 150,000 plus in the Navy, 150,000 plus in the Air Force. You've got Rosgvardia, who not all of them are combat-capable units, and some of the combat-capable ones are in Ukraine, but they're not tank units. And as for those reservists, they're a mixture of hypothetical and politically untenable. They have brought their best. Now, mobilization would fundamentally change things. If Russia does decide to flick the switch, call it a war, and mobilize everything they've got, sure, different story. But that's not how this argument goes. This argument says that they have one ready to go. They don't. Then the next subpoint is that they're showing restraint in the use of fires. This is an interesting one because it was likely true in the first few days. The Russian initial standoff munition bombardment was remarkably light compared to what a lot of Western observers had expected. There were no pulverizing artillery attacks at Ukrainian positions on the border. And as we saw, the initial vanguard of Russian offensives were often light units doing thunder runs down roads and bypassing urban centers. We had Rosgvardia units being involved. We had light airborne landings. They seem to be pulling a lot of punches and using light forces rather than the heavy artillery-based advance that you would expect of the Russian and before them the Soviet forces. But I would ask for evidence that this is still the case. Right now, we have lots of evidence of use of artillery, of MLRS systems, of cluster munitions against urban areas. We've got a lot of evidence the VVS is flying missions using dumb bombs. I'm not sure how much more indiscriminate you can get than dropping dumb bombs from fighter bomber aircraft, manually using coordinates that you write on a piece of paper and then navigate to using inertial navigation or simple GPS systems. And that's the situation that they are in right now. Mariupol, other areas have been very heavily bombarded. So there are also alternative theses you can deploy here. Is Russia instead gated by logistical challenges? Remember, rocket ammunition is incredibly heavy. It takes a lot of trucks to carry reloads for a battery of grads, for example. So that's a bottleneck on how many fires they can use. They've also got problems in terms of fire control and reconnaissance, but I'll concede here there's a lack of certainty. Russian artillery and Russian fires have certainly become more prominent in terms of what we've seen visual evidence of and reported evidence of from the Russian media, from the Ukrainian media, and from other open sources over the last few weeks. These fires have become more common, but we still don't know whether or not they are less than we might have expected because of logistical challenges, fire control challenges, or because the Russians themselves are being restrained in how they use them. Certainly there are a lot of residents of areas across Ukraine who would argue that they are not, in fact, being that restrained. And if any of those alternative theses hold water, if the logistical challenges are a factor, for example, then it's not something Russia can just fix overnight. But my final point on all of this is why do these arguments even matter? They don't really, because when you look at them all, except for the Russia has huge reserves point, when you look at Russia could flatten Ukraine or Russia could be less discriminate in its use of fires, you're basically saying Russia could destroy a lot more Ukrainian buildings, infrastructure, and civilian population if it chose to. The counter-argument I would put is, what would that achieve? There's tremendous historical precedence for the ability of nations to endure very heavy damage to their civilian infrastructure. Japan, under Allied bombing, which killed 100,000 people in a single raid on Tokyo, which basically burned the city to a crisp. Germany, under Allied bombing for years, enduring. Korea, where the majority of most cities, most substantial structure, a majority of substantial structures in North Korea were destroyed during the Korean War, and yet the thing ended in a draw. Vietnam, which endured linebacker, for example, endured rolling thunder. Far grander campaigns of strategic destruction of infrastructure, territory, and civilian population than anything Russia can unleash on Ukraine. And those campaigns did not succeed in bringing nations to their knees. I did research on the cost efficiency, the hard economic calculus of the RAF and USAF strategic bombing campaign on Germany during World War II. And the evaluation was, yes, They do cause tremendous economic damage, and yes, they do have some value from a military perspective, but they would not have been decisive in and of themselves. You could not have broken Germany, really, without a dramatic escalation or indeed the land offensives that were taking place. And I'd also ask the question, could Zelensky sell a ceasefire? Because Russian victory usually ends with a ceasefire. Most plausible scenarios end with a ceasefire, not a total victory. And do you think Zelensky would be able to sell a peace treaty, a peace treaty to the Ukrainian people if Russia was carpet bombing cities en masse, leveling blocks and making millions of people homeless on an ongoing basis? Historical precedents would say that would probably actually trigger patriotic resentment and greater resistance if the Ukrainians are anything like the Germans, the Soviets, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the list goes on. Russia endured great hardship during the Great Patriotic War and still fought on. There's no reason to suggest the Ukrainians aren't capable of the same thing. And it's even less of an argument when you point out that the usual economic justification for strategic bombing or systemic destruction, where you're destroying civilian infrastructure and blasting people out of the ruins, doesn't even apply here. Because even if you destroy Ukraine's centers of economic production, of government, the primary economic engine and munitions manufacturing capability of Ukraine going forward is not in Ukraine, it's in the West. So if you're not willing to extend your campaign of destruction to NATO countries, then this is not a winning argument. So let's flip around. Those are the Russia boo arguments, the arguments that basically say either Russia has already won or could easily win if it chose to do so. The flip side of this is Ukrainian and Western triumphalism, the idea that after the victory at Kiev, the Russian army is essentially broken, that Ukraine has won. And this argument I understand from a sense of victorious elation overcoming a people, but it doesn't stand up to any degree of close consideration, because at its heart is the assumption that just because the Russian army has been savaged and has performed poorly to date, it can't learn and it can't reconstitute. And both of those are, I think, bad assumptions. The Russian army, or rather the Soviet army, humiliated itself in the opening stages of the Winter War. It did eventually learn its lessons, scale up, reconstitute, and close the issue. The VVS started the Great Patriotic War with terrible tactics and practices, but under fire and after horrendous losses, they learnt from the Germans, they reconstituted, they replaced their pilots, their aircraft, they learnt new tactics, they counterattacked, and ultimately they were victorious. Now, the key point here is that, yes, Russia is politically limited, but it does have a tremendous amount of capacity if it chooses to exercise it to reconstitute its forces, to learn and redouble its efforts. I was originally going to do a slide or two here on examples of how Russia could do so, things that I would think would be very, very well known to members of the Russian general staff, but I saw some opposition on previous videos to doing hypotheticals on how Russia could fix problems that it's been having or how it could reconstitute its forces. So even though it's interesting from a military industrial perspective, I'm going to skip it. I won't go into details about the steps. I will just settle for asserting in this case that Russia is a large country with a significant military industrial base, with significant reserves that it can tap on if it finds the political will. The key point here is, will Russia decide it's at war, and will it do things like approve a budget, declare war officially, declare a national emergency, and allow itself to mobilize its industry and its manpower in order to reconstitute itself? This is also a good point to talk about Ukrainian overclaiming, because we talked about Russian overclaiming earlier in the piece, and look at it. I follow the Ukrainian MOD, just like I followed the Russian one. Now, if you cross-reference Ukrainian claims with visually confirmed losses, you see similar patterns emerging across system types that you do with the Russians, but to a much lesser overall extent. That is, many more Ukrainian claims correspond with visually confirmed losses than in the Russian cases. Russia claims are far more disconnected from the visually confirmed databases that we have, open source intelligence for, so we're more confident in most of them. In fact, for some systems like surface-to-air missile launchers, we've actually confirmed something like 3/4 of Ukrainian claims. The Ukrainians claim 55 anti-aircraft warfare systems. We have visually confirmed 44 losses as of the time that I did this comparison. Still, the gap in terms of aircraft and helicopters, which you'll notice was also a major issue for Russian systems, are very, very high. Ukraine claims 130 aircraft destroyed. We have visual confirmations on 20. Now, it's interesting that this same pattern eventuates. In some ways, it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of reasons that you would have overclaiming when dealing with aerial targets. Aerial targets would often crash outside of your area, or you might see a hit. You might not know if an aircraft gets back successfully. If you're launching missiles and you don't maintain a visual contact, you might think you have destroyed something when in reality you've just lost a radar contact. It's evaded your missile, it makes it back home. There's lots of reasons that kills on aircraft and helicopters are harder to confirm than, for example, losses on tanks, because a lot of these losses against tanks are being scored by ATGMs that have visual evidence of the kill, or the wrecks in areas that are under Ukrainian control after the conflict, so you can take photographs of them. So in terms of the baseline, we're reasonably confident that the Ukrainian overclaims are probably less extensive than the Russians, because again, visually confirmed losses are just a flaw. Not every loss is going to be photographed and submitted for categorization, consideration, and measured on Oryx or other open source measurement systems. So those blue bars are pretty safe minimums. Still, the Ukrainian claims are quite possibly a little bit too high. They certainly don't strain credulity the way the Russians do, because the Russians came in with a lot more material, so it's not like the Ukrainians are claiming they have destroyed 70% of all Russian vehicles that have entered Ukraine or anything like that, whereas the Russians are claiming those sort of ratios for some systems. But we should still consider that maybe the Ukrainian MOD figures are a little bit flawed. The other sort of sub-myth here I want to talk about on the Ukrainian triumphalism side, because I think it deserves a coverage, and it has made it into the media, as you can see from the articles there, is the idea that Ukraine actually has more equipment now than when it started the war because of everything it's captured from the Russians. I think this is a result of really optimistic application of open source figures, the Oryx figures. People who just look at the number of Ukrainian tanks confirmed visually lost, which is 95 when I did the measure on April 7th, versus 182 tanks captured. Therefore, clearly Ukraine has gained in tanks overall. Now look, that is impressive. And yes, that's part of why the tractor brigade and the workshops and the defense businesses supporting the Ukrainian army are so important. Because capturing these vehicles, recovering them, repairing them, putting them back into service is key to maintaining Ukrainian firepower until Western support can ramp up. It also points to the relevance of former Warsaw Pact states as useful not just in providing entire systems, but in providing things like repair parts and services in order to try and get these captured vehicles online again. But there's a lot of reasons that I would raise a serious eyebrow over these figures being taken one for one. The first is captures of Russian vehicles by Ukrainian forces are far more likely logically to be photographed, uploaded, categorized, and measured than the destruction of Ukrainian hardware by Russians. As a general rule, a lot of the Russians had their cell phones confiscated before they went in. A lot of Ukrainians are not in a rush to categorize their own losses. Whereas captures, man, you throw that camera out, you put it on TikTok because you captured a tank, man. You're a badass. There are reasons to suggest that the Ukrainian visual loss claims are less likely to be covered than the ones that Ukraine has in turn captured. Also, a lot of the Russians seem to be putting their bragging photos and images where they do take them. They tend to go up on Telegram and whatnot. Do not all of them make their way to sources like Oryx? They're harder to harvest. A lot of them do, and a lot of them are being seen, but they're harder to harvest. So there is reasons to raise a question mark over how much above that floor the loss figures actually are. I think that 95 is probably too low. There's also major assumptions here that when you capture a bit of hardware, it's working. Many of these captured vehicles, and remember, with Oryx, you can go and see every image of every captured vehicle. Click on it, see the image, check if it's been categorized incorrectly. You can do all of that. Many of the captured vehicles are shown stripped, damaged, or they're static, or they're shown being towed. So they've had all their ERA plates, all their electronics, their machine guns and whatnot pulled off them. You have to wonder if the Ukrainians would have done that if the vehicle was in working order and could be sent straight back into action. More likely, like they've taken the tank and they strip it of everything valuable because they don't think they're going to be able to put it back into service immediately. A lot needs to happen in order to take a recovered armored vehicle or a captured armored vehicle and convert it into a operational armored vehicle. You need to recover it. You need to then get it somewhere that has access to the tools, the equipments, the spares, and the know-how to repair any damage that was done to it, refuel it, rearm it. You need to find yourself a crew that knows how to operate it, get it in there, get it to a unit that can operate it, and then you have an operational tank. It's also not clear if Russians are doing things like sabotaging the internals of these vehicles or whatnot. So while we can assume that captured pieces are at the very least a source of, say, spare parts for the Ukrainians, assuming a one-for-one capture to reoperational ratio isn't fair. And I'm really worried about this myth because it seems to take the impetus off donor powers from providing replacement heavy equipment. The question is asked, why is there so much pressure for like the Czechs to provide their T-72s or the former Warsaw Pact countries to shift heavy equipment across the border if the Ukrainians are just capturing so much gear from the Russians? Well, A, the answer is you always want more tanks, but B, the answer is it's probably not as simple as saying we've captured 182, we've lost 95, therefore we're up overall. I'm not so sure. So those are the myths that I wanted to cover. The key arguments I've seen pop up in the media, in comment sections and whatnot that I thought deserved a little bit of a dismissal before we got to the main question, which is how to assess who's winning. And I want to stress I wasn't keen on attacking this question. I've avoided it for multiple videos. I'm drawn to more readily assess questions. But because there's pressure to answer it and people voted for me to answer it, my main point is I want to make a defensible assessment of what a power's goal is. Like what is Russia trying to achieve, for example? And therefore, what would it take in order to achieve their goals? And if they're close to doing so, then they're winning, right? If Russia is out to achieve X, it looks like it's going to get X, then they would be winning. And for the sake of this exercise and to limit the amount of criticism, I'm going to take Russia at its word in terms of what its stated objectives are. I'm not going to impute additional objectives. I'm going to take what Russia has argued are its objectives at their word in order to do this analysis. And those objectives are the demilitarization of Ukraine, the denazification of Ukraine, the protection/liberation of the Donbass, and countering NATO expansion. Do I think those cases are full of... yes, I do think they're full of it, but let's take them as they are. On this first point, demilitarization, and the Russian MOD comes back to this point often. General Konashenkov, I listen to him almost every day. Big focus on the destruction of Ukraine's capacity to wage war. He's always talking about the military infrastructure and Ukrainian military equipment that has been destroyed. So the idea here is Russia will have achieved victory if it has demilitarized Ukraine, because a demilitarized Ukraine is not able to then be a threat to Russia or the Donbass, so the argument goes. The issue here is that it's not just about Ukraine's active military capability, it's about Ukraine's ability to reconstitute its military capability after it suffers losses. And by making this a hot proxy war, where Ukraine has been able to engage support from the West, the Ukrainian military-industrial complex is no longer the bottleneck on their military capability. You can destroy every armed works in Ukraine, doesn't matter, because Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and the various Rheinmetall and the various European giants are still active and can still produce kit. So even if you leveled every arms factory in Ukraine, Ukraine would still remilitarize relatively quickly. And the delivery of aid has intensified, not abated, and there's every reason to believe that that trend will continue, that the rate of delivery will eventually increase, not decrease over time. And the outside limits of that, and this is why I really want to do a video on the prospects of Russia in a long war, the outside limits of what that trend looks like if you extrapolate it out, and in a realistic case, is that Ukrainian militarization gets out of control very, very quickly. Certainly grows beyond the ability of the Russian armed forces to contain. So even if you take the Russian MOD at their word here, in order to actually demilitarize Ukraine, it's not enough to just destroy their equipment. You can do one of three things. You can force Ukraine to accept, like by treaty, demilitarization, to sign an agreement, maybe put it in its constitution to accept neutral, demilitarized status. Those are two different things. You can be neutral and yet militarized. If you want to demilitarize Ukraine, it needs to agree not to have an army or not to have certain weapons. You can do that. which means putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine, which means why the hell did you withdraw from Kiev? The second thing you can do is destroy the military-industrial complex supporting Ukraine. But that's in the West, so pass, right? Unless you want to start World War III. You're having enough trouble taking Ukraine, you don't want to start World War III. The third option is you can conquer and exercise control and influence over the whole territory of Ukraine. Ukraine can't remilitarize if Ukraine is Russia, or Ukraine is a Russian puppet, which is one of the reasons why I come to this with the assumption that Russia did originally intend to significantly pressure Ukraine and possibly put a puppet back into power. Then there's the ostensible goal of denazification, and I'm not sure I can talk about this one with a straight face, even giving the Russians all the possible benefit of the doubt. This is such an obvious wolf whistle to the collective memory of the Great Patriotic War and the fight against fascism, attempting to apply it to a modern Ukrainian state that is in no way fascistic. But here's the logical problem at the core of the Russian argument, besides the fact that Ukraine isn't a bloody fascist country. If it was, if the Russian bullshit was true, then have you really achieved your goal if you just pinprick around the edges? If you are facing a fascist country, isn't the only acceptable outcome the removal of that government from power? So a retreat from Kiev, a move towards just securing the Donbass, is incompatible with the Russian bullshit argument that Ukraine is a fascistic country. My simple contention is that if Vladimir Putin actually believed that this stuff was true, then the only ethically, intellectually defensible position for him would be the removal of the government in Kiev, which is exactly what the Russian military has said it's not about to do. It's not principally consistent in the slightest. Then there's the question of the Donbass. This is the ostensible casus belli and invasion trigger. Donetsk and Luhansk asked for military assistance from Russia. That was the casus belli. Russia went to war. It's also the justification for the current strategic switch we see, wherein Russia is moving away from Kiev and refocusing on the Eastern Front, the Donetsk-Luhansk area of operations. But then you have to ask yourself the question, what is security for the Donbass? The main complaint that Russia has had is allegations of shelling of civilian areas. But if you're going to protect all of the Donbass from shelling, ostensibly, surely that means pushing the security perimeter out beyond the actual border of the Donbass, out beyond the range of, well, at the very least, gun artillery, but also long-range rocket systems, presumably. Otherwise, they're in the same threatened, in inverted commas, positions they were as before. And if you do create that security perimeter, what's the status of civilians within that perimeter? Do you care about their protection? Do you need to make a security perimeter for your security perimeter to make sure that the people in your security perimeter aren't shelled? It's difficult to extrapolate exactly what this would be without a significant concession from the Ukrainian government. So really, again, the Russians would have three options to declare a win on this one. Either they'd have a very different security perimeter demilitarized zone around Donbass and Luhansk to protect them, or they'd have legal Ukrainian recognition of the status of the LNR and the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, or, they'd completely occupy or puppet. Yeah, you've seen me go down this before. Basically, you need to force Ukraine to concede or control all of Ukraine in order to guarantee that Donetsk and Luhansk will be secure forevermore. And the final argument was halting NATO expansion. This is an argument that was very often made. The idea was that NATO was expanding, Ukraine may join NATO, that would threaten Russia, therefore Ukraine had to be attacked to prevent it joining NATO. So this is presumably, if we take the Russians at their word, about improving Russia's net security situation. Now, even in the case that Ukraine agreed to write neutrality into their constitution, I'd question whether or not this objective has actually been met in terms of protecting or improving Russian security. We've already seen Finland and Sweden rapidly switch their positions towards joining NATO, away from positions of avowed neutrality. Russia's frontage with Finland would be a security nightmare. Finland puts NATO right on the doorstep of St. Petersburg. It's a long border that Russia would then have to garrison and watch. Finland and Sweden are major and capable military powers that will be tremendous assets to the NATO alliance. They also have predictably invigorated Western opposition. Germany is going to rearm. Western powers are going to reinvigorate their military complexes. The number of US troops permanently stationed in Eastern Europe is going to increase, and we may see further commitments announced in the days, weeks, and months that follow. In short, even if you succeeded in dominating Ukraine, the net security result of this conflict, in terms of reducing the ostensible threat posed by NATO to Russia, this war is already a failure. Any of these factors individually, Finnish and Swedish potential membership in NATO, German rearmament, Western reinvigoration, increased Western unity, the trade sanctions, US deployments to Europe, each of these individually probably decrease Russian security more than anything they could feasibly accomplish in Ukraine. But again, even if you accomplished your goal in Ukraine, if you forced Ukraine to write neutrality into its constitution, is that really a guarantee that once Ukraine has rearmed and rebuilt itself somewhere down the line, that a government isn't going to run for election in Ukraine on a revanchist platform and basically say that whatever they signed is the new Treaty of Versailles, rip it up and try and join an alliance anyway? The long-term improvement in Russian security just isn't there in any case in this invasion. It's one of the reasons why I think invading from a strategic perspective was a batshit idea. The only way it possibly could have worked is if this war was over in a couple of days, if Ukraine was under a puppet government, and if, as a result of the really short state of the war, the West mostly accepted it. In that sense, it's already too late. So, taking all that together, Russia is not on track to achieve its objectives. Ukraine's objectives, too, are probably not in immediate reach. Depends on how they define them. That would need to be its own discussion, whether you define Ukrainian victory as survival or reclaiming all of its lost territories. But Russia's goals unambiguously relied on either some sort of capitulation or a significant negotiated surrender of Ukrainian sovereignty over points of neutrality, NATO membership, the secession of territories in the Donbass, the legal secession of Crimea. Like, Russia's goals required that Ukraine be bent over a barrel or totally defeated, and neither of those now seem likely. With Russian forces withdrawn from Kiev, the mechanism to pressure the center of gravity of the Ukrainian political system and the body politic is gone. The retreat from Kiev is inconsistent with the requirements Russia would need to have in order to achieve its objectives. It's also inconsistent with their kill claims, because if they have destroyed the Ukrainian military, then they should be able to waltz into Kiev. I'd add to this the fact that I don't believe Russia can win a long war. This is something I'm a lot less ambiguous on than everything else I judge, because here the numbers stack up. And that will be the next video I do, an examination of what this war looks like if it goes long and all powers involved choose to commit to it. But if pressed, and I know I've been pressed, to answer the question of who is winning, I'm going to give a lawyer's answer. Russia is not in a position to realistically achieve its stated objectives at a reasonable cost and in a reasonable period of time. And if you want to hear me say it, I'll say it, but I'm definitely not putting in the damn slides. Russia's not winning this war. And no matter how you wrap the arguments or mythology around it, Russia is in a worse position in terms of achieving its objectives than it was a week ago. They might still win. It's possible. I'm not saying it's impossible that Russia wins this war. They could reconstitute themselves. Ukraine's politics could undergo a complete shift. War is full of uncertainty. But looking at it right now, with the retreat from Kiev, with the loss figures, the visually confirmed loss figures being what they are, the status of economic support flowing in from other countries, the prospects of Russia achieving the objectives that it stated it wanted to achieve is minimal. It's entirely possible they walk away and can claim they've won. I talked about that at the start. Like, there's a lot of ways to construct an argument that they have won, but if you take them at their word on what they were seeking to achieve, they're not going to achieve it. All right, let's do a quick channel update to wind that all up. These videos that I've done on the Ukraine crisis and the military-industrial complex more broadly, I hope, going forward, have absolutely blown my mind in terms of how they've been received. It's become very clear that there is at least a population out there who appreciates this content, who's willing to listen to this conflict, who enjoys slideshows that go for 50 minutes on YouTube, which is not the sort of content I thought would be swallowed up. So bad jokes and good analysis it is going forward. I'm going to continue to do defense industry and security content. The next video is going to be on the long war scenario. So getting back to my roots, looking at from a military and industrial and economic perspective, why the long war scenario really, really heavily disfavors Russia if this war does indeed go long. And secondly, looking at the topic of German rearmament, possibly splitting that into 2 videos because I am cheeky, and I want to look not just at German rearmament, but also the potential of what happens if you start looking at rearmament from a European perspective. If a couple of nations, and I think we can all predict which nations they would be, agree to get together and think about this in a cohesive fashion, what the potential is for a new security arrangement, defense industrial arrangement on the European continent. I do want to reinvigorate some of the gaming content going forward. I haven't forgotten about it, but I'm also very aware that people who have subscribed to this channel are largely not here for the gaming content. About 90% of you have joined since the Ukraine coverage started, and as a result, it seems only fair to split the channel up. What will probably have to happen, and I'll make sure I do announcements on this before it happens, is there will probably be a spin-off, like a Perun gaming channel, which is linked to this one, where the gaming videos go. Obviously, people who are interested in both are welcome to subscribe to both, but it does mean that you can freely subscribe to this channel and not be worried that I'm going to spam you with Phoenix Point, or when it eventually comes out, Terra Invicta content, for example, that you can subscribe to the channel that actually provides the content that you want. This will remain the channel for the military industrial content for now, and occasionally new series launches, whereas the other one will host the gaming content. I do have Patreon. It's on my About page. It will serve both classes of content. So if you want to support either what I'm doing on the defense and industry space and what I'm doing in the gaming space, that's open to contributors for both. I see no reason to split that in 2. Thank you again for your incredible and amazing support. Thank you for the kind comments and the engagement. Thank you for the reasoned arguments that you have all made. Thank you for continuing to engage with this channel, and thank you for remembering that even though we talk about these issues from an analytical perspective and in occasionally quite a cold and intellectual way, thank you for remembering that there are a lot of human beings involved in the tragedies that continue to unfold right now. And no matter how long this war goes, we can't take our eye off those human elements. Thank you again for your amazing support, and you'll hear from me again soon.